So yeah, my name is Nikki. I'm a user experience researcher at Blizzard. I've been there for about 2 years now. And accessibility has sort of become like a side project that I've been working on that has quickly become like a passion project of mine, which is something that I'm really trying to ramp up at Blizzard. And I was like, this would be a really great opportunity to bring this to you guys as well, because you're in a really sweet position where you can explore a lot of stuff being students working on student projects. So quick overview, we'll do really quick like who I am, then we'll talk about what accessibility is, what you can do, and some examples of best practices that exist right now. So a little bit about me. I get to be Dr. Nikki Crenshaw now because I finished my PhD. I'm a researcher at Blizzard, like I mentioned. So I did my PhD here at UCI. My dissertation work was on social experience and WoW and how it's changed as an artifact of the game design and communities evolving. Before that, I got a BA from UC Santa Cruz in psychology. Right now, my primary research interests are games research. That's my bread and butter. That's what I do day to day. Accessibility, which has become the thing that I'm also starting to do day to day. Social affordances, which are essentially the way that technology lets you interact with other people. And player identity and the way people represent themselves. And that's more like hobby. I just think it's really cool when people talk about their avatars and their character names. I still play video games all the time. This is some of the stuff I'm playing right now. My email, if anybody wants to get a hold of me. And then a bunch of characters from games that I really like. Yay! So a little bit about getting into Blizzard, because a lot of people will ask me this question, so I'll just get out of the way up front. I came into the internship program in kind of a weird way. So the Games Research SIG group through IGDA has a summit that happens every year where games researchers in the community all get together and talk and share research and stuff. I actually met my boss there. I've been going for about 5 years, and he happened to be there, my current boss. Actually, my original boss at Blizzard, but my current boss I also know through that group. So it was a really good group to be involved with. So I told him, like, hey, I'm finishing my PhD, do you guys have any head count? And he was like, no, but we have this internship slot that we have to fill. So he's like, you can send me your resume and I'll, see what the deal is. So this was my timeline. I sent him the resume on the 6th, and by 6 p.m. that same day, I had an interview scheduled. The phone interview was on the 10th, in-person interviews 2 days later, and then my offer was on the 17th, which was literally the deadline for them to accept interns. So this is not normal. I don't recommend this. Apply on the normal timeline. I have some info about that at the end of this talk. So the conversion, because I was an intern for about 6 months, and then was converted to full-time at the end of the year. So this is a little bit more normal. December 7th, I was like, hey, this is going to happen. There was this weird negotiation period. In January, I received a letter, and then I was converted and stuff. But that was my general path. And then I started with the BattleNet UX team, which was a mix of designers and researchers. I'm now on the Games User Research team, which is purely researchers, and we support all of our teams at Blizzard. Cool, so that is all about me. Now we're going to go on to accessibility. So when I talk about accessibility, I really talk about correcting any mismatch between a user and their environment. So that's much broader than disability, which is usually what people think about in terms of accessibility. This definition includes things like, let's say you're out in the sun on your phone and there's screen glare. Having good contrast ratio is something that would really benefit you in that situation, or having larger text size is something that would benefit you. Let's say you want to be playing games, but your roommate is asleep in the room, so you have to play with your sound off or with headphones on. That's a situation that you would also benefit from accessible design choices. So much broader than just players with disabilities, and that's kind of the thing that I want you guys to be thinking about as we go through this. So we're addressing any kind of impairment to cognition, to hearing, motor skills, speech, and vision. Those are sort of like the 5 categories that I've been focusing on primarily. And there's a few different types of disabilities. So a disability is any impairment to your physical or mental ability to perform some kind of task. And that can be something that is permanent, so it's something that exists through your whole life. If you're colorblind, you're born colorblind, there's some SIG glasses now that can sort of help you see like different colors, but for the most part, that's something that you have for the rest of your life. It can be temporary, so some injury or illness that causes you to have some impairment for a certain period of time. If you break your arm, maybe you can't use your mouse in the way that you would before, but eventually you'll regain functionality and likely be able to use it as you would previously. Or situationally, so like some environmental circumstances. So that's like if you have a baby in the next room and you can't put the sound on, or any kind of situational sort of thing. Some general information on disability, because people are interested in this stuff. About 15% of the global population lives with some form of disability. And the World Health Organization estimates that this is the largest growing minority on the planet. Any ideas why? The line is stairs. So the main reason is because people are living longer. And age and disability are just kind of associated with each other. So because people are growing older, we have more medical advances and things like that, people are living longer, and then new health things are kind of popping up. PopGap Games, which is a mobile game studio, did a survey of their gamers and found that 20% of their gamers live with some form of disability. So I think this is kind of more representative of the gamer population than just like everybody in the world kind of thing. But this is really interesting because it means basically 1 in 5 gamers has some form of disability. From that same survey, they compared gamers with disability to able-bodied gamers, and they found that gamers with disabilities played games more frequently, played for more hours per week, played longer sessions, and saw gaming as being more beneficial overall. So this is like the hardcore gaming audience. Like these players are in it. Some people have asked us about specific disabilities, like how prevalent are different disabilities in our player base. And so this is the closest statistic that I could find. This is a survey of the American population, so adults in the United States. And the general estimation is 5% of people live with a visual disability, 6% with auditory disabilities, 11% with cognitive disabilities, and 14% with motor disabilities. And so you might be looking at this and you're like, that is much bigger than 15 or 20%. What? And so the takeaway here isn't like, okay, motor disabilities is 14% of the population, that's the biggest bang for our buck. The point is really, disabilities come in a constellation, so you can't just focus on one of them. So you could have somebody who has a visual disability and a physical disability, or a motor disability. So just being like, we're going to focus on this one because it's the highest percentage of the population, there's still going to be things that they're not accommodated with in that way. I have a video here. Sweet. So this is Ken Worrell. He's a gamer who lives with, he's quadriplegic, so he's in a wheelchair. And I thought this video was really awesome. Oh, do we have sound in here? Maybe, we'll find out. So I really thought his story was super cool and I just wanted to show it. He's also a huge Blizzard gamer, so no bias, obviously. But
well, this lady came in from GS Strong, which is a rehab center now. Said, Ken, I got something you might like. This new game called Snapple. And I said, oh, this is kind of cool. I'm kind of into the magic and swords and all this stuff. How can I play it? So then she introduced a joust. And the joust is a device that I insert, I put in my mouth, and where I move, I go to that target, or I move my character. So that was working out really well. So, and then you go with that. She told me that I could sit, the left click and puff the right. I'm like, oh, just like, I was like, yeah, I'm in heaven here. But as I got better and better, I started to kind of play Diablo series. And then I played for a while, and then Warcraft came out. So I tried Warcraft, and I'm like, I kind of like this game. So I started playing for a while, and then I played StarCraft again. That day, when the woman came and introduced me to these games, really opened up my life. And I think gave me the confidence to get through my injury and be who I am today. I love games.
So I'll stop it there, but he goes on. It's a really cool video. I really recommend it. But this is awesome because this is a way that games and intentional design for people with disabilities really helped this guy in a severe way. He was in one of the hardest moments of his life, and this just kind of opened up his world for him again. And it's because people spent the time to develop technologies and develop games that interface with these technologies that let him have access in the first place. He also streams on Twitch as No Hands Ken, and he's awesome. So what can you guys do? Like now you know a little bit about this, what can you do? When you design for accessibility, you're giving access to people who wouldn't be able to play your games otherwise, but you're also likely going to benefit the vast majority of your users and a lot of people who would be interacting with your game anyway. So this is a little factoid that I thought was pretty cool. Ubisoft tracked subtitle usage in Assassin's Creed Origins across all their platforms. It's a feature that's off by default, so you have to go in and manually turn it on. And they track it for everybody. Any guesses on the percentage of users who play with subtitles on? 60%. Someone's a mind reader. 60. So over half. And this is a feature that now gave deaf and hard of hearing players the ability to play through the games because they're like, I actually know what's going on in cutscenes now. But also was something that just over half of the player base decided to use anyway. So that's like one cool way. We were talking about, it's not just about disabilities, it can benefit everyone. And this is like a really good example of that. Same thing with Fortnite. So this is Fortnite Mobile. And one of the things that they introduced are these little indicators around the outside of your character that show sound indicators. So like the one down here, you can see there's footprint noises and there's also gunshot noises. So you know somebody's walking and shooting behind you. And this is kind of like a cool instance of like accidental accessibility where this feature was originally put in because they're like mobile devices, it's rude to have your sound on your phone on the train, we'll put these in. And the deaf and hard of hearing community were like, I know what's going on in the game now. So there was like a lot of like uproar in the community about like, please put this on PC, this helps so much. There's all these situations where I can use this feature and it would help give me that additional contextual information that I don't get because I can't hear or I can't have the sound on or whatever it might be. So now I'm going to look at a few best practices with you guys. These are just some examples. So basically the way we're going to go through it, we'll get there in a second. So in thinking about how you guys evaluate, are you successful in designing accessibly, there's a few different guidelines that you can look at for reference. So there's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So if any of you are web devs or do like HTML stuff, that's really good for this. So the WCAG is the first one, and that deals with like content, the way things are formatted on pages, what font size to use, all that kind of stuff. And then the Accessible Rich Internet Application Suite is like essentially tools where you're like, hey, I need it to do this, and you can hook into those APIs and kind of get it interfacing with your thing. Since I know you're all gamers as well and game devs, the Games Accessibility Guidelines is a set of best practices for accessibility in games specifically. This is all hyperlinked too, so I think I can send the deck out to you guys and everyone can check it out on their own. So going through each of these a little bit more in depth, again, the WCAG is a set of guidelines for how to make your web content accessible. I still think it's a really useful starting place for games as well because they have a lot more like hard and fast numbers of like use font size X, like use hitbox ratio of this. And sometimes you just kind of have to like fudge it of like, okay, well I'm on a phone and 40 pixels is huge, so I can't do that. But it is a good way to kind of start thinking about that stuff. So it includes things like the text, images, and sound that might be on your page, and also how that stuff is structured and presented, how it interacts when you use keyboards and things like that. So as an example here, there's different compliance levels for the WCAG. So single A is sort of like the bare minimum. Like every site should do this, every site does not do this. So that's sort of like baseline. Double A is considered industry standard right now, so that's what most places will shoot for. And then triple A is like some above and beyond stuff. But just as an example here, a single A thing would be color isn't the only method of identification for any object. Clear colorblind consideration makes sense. Double A is making sure that any of your text and images have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. And then AAA is bumping that up to 7 to 1. And there's tools and resources that exist for like checking, like in particular contrast ratio. You can check this stuff automatically. It's really cool. This stuff all exists basically for free on the internet, which is pretty sick. The Games Accessibility Guidelines, so this one is specifically for gaming. It includes things like suggested design guidelines for designing with gamers with disabilities. Some best practices examples, so they have links to like screenshots of games, and they're like, hey, here's this particular feature and how it looks in Call of Duty, or whatever. As well as quotes from players who benefit from that design decision. So like somebody who's like, I love it when a game has X because it actually lets me play, or it's something that I really need to think about, like with the considerations I have. Similar to the WCAG, there's guidelines here, so basic, intermediate, advanced, sort of same breakdown. So for this one, a basic thing, allow controls to be remapped and configured. If you can't use a keyboard and mouse, but there's no controller support, yes, you can't play that game. So that's a consideration to think about. Intermediate support more than one input device, so that's another really good one. If you have keyboard support, as well as controller support, as well as like the Microsoft Adaptive Controller, if any of you guys have seen that, there was like the Super Bowl commercial that like makes you cry. But yeah, there's another one. And then advanced, a cooldown period of at least 0.5 seconds between inputs. So for some people with like Parkinson's or certain like motor control issues, you might like double tap a button, and if there's no cooldown in between, it's like a false input, right? So things like that can help. Okay, this is what I was talking about earlier. So the way this is broken down, you can see up at the top, we have different considerations there. And we're gonna go through just kind of some examples of like, here's a motor control issue, let's talk about how you might solve that through your game design. So here, the player experience, and I'm defining it this way because I don't want to focus solely just on disability. A player has difficulty tapping buttons rapidly and precisely. There could be a number of reasons that cause this. Some example conditions, arthritis, strain injuries, Parkinson's, anything like that. So how do you solve this? Don't require button mashing. A lot of quick time events where you have to like press buttons really rapidly. Don't require quick time events. Provide some alternatives, so like something where you have to press rapidly, you can also set as a toggle. So click it once, it's on, click it again, it's off. And here's a couple examples of this. So in Spider-Man, there's a setting for QuickTime autocomplete. So instead of actually going through the QuickTime events, we'll just kind of bypass them. This is from The Witcher 2, I think. And this is another one, repeated button pressions. You can set it to tap or toggle, so you can adjust how that's set up. Another example, a player has a limited range of motion or limited control of motion. Allow for controller sensitivity options in your game. So a lot of times your OS will let you do this, but if you can do it within the game as well, that way you can customize it for that particular experience, great choice. Allow for control remapping. Maybe somebody has a really hard time using their mouse, so they just want to bind all their mouse keys to their keyboard instead. Allow for multiple input devices. So this is one from Far Cry New Dawn, where they have mouse acceleration, how much the acceleration is going to happen, how the look sensitivity is, and that's all broken out into their own features. So it can be really customizable depending on the player. Overwatch is another really good example. So they have, you can see horizontal sensitivity, vertical sensitivity, invert your look. That's all stuff that lets you kind of customize how your movement is going to work. Moving on to visual things. So let's say somebody has a hard time reading the on-screen text. This happens to me when you play anything on like those 4K monitors and all the text is this big and you're like, what's happening? So providing subtitles is a huge one, and making sure that your subtitles have different sizes, have letterboxing, so like there's a solid background behind it, so it's not just bleeding into all of the environmental things happening, and making sure that there's a high contrast background between your text and the letterbox. Also making sure there's a high contrast between your text UI and the background of your thing. So if you're like writing a text and like white text on a light brown background where it's like it's a scroll or something like that, just check the contrast ratios. Again, there's a lot of free tools that I would be happy to point you guys to. So I think the coolest example of this one is Life is Strange, where there's subtitles that you can turn on. There's a subtitle overlay thing that you can turn on, and there are sizes where like normal, large, and hella large. Which is like a fun way to do it, right? It stays within the theme of the game, but also still gives those customization options. And that's kind of like what it looks like. Like when you turn it on, this is sort of how it would appear in the game. This is a good one. Say it again.
For honor.
For honor, yes, thank you. So they do this really cool thing where for determining your UI, the UI is on its own little bounding box for like the health and stuff, so it's not fading into the background and you're like, okay, great, white bars on this like super white background. That's gonna be hard to see. Also that everybody is indicated with the icons that are also extremely high contrast and very distinct from the background, so it makes it very clear to see where people are. Here's another visual one. So a player has a difficulty discerning between different on-screen elements. Provide colorblind options. That's a really great one. Offer customizability of different on-screen elements. So some games will let you do this where it's like, hey, like our colorblind mode will just change the way it's, instead of red and green, it's red and blue or whatever it might be. So here's one from Call of Duty where you can actually change what your crosshair looks like and change the color of your crosshair. So if the default one is too hard to see, you can adjust how that will look on the background for you. This is from a puzzle game that actually lets you turn on. So here's the colorblind mode. This is a really great way to solve for any colorblind issues. You associate the color with a symbol. And so that way, if I can't discern between this ring of colors, I at least have icons that I can understand and see them in the visual elements in the game. Auditory cues, let's say the player has difficulty hearing any spoken dialogue. Provide subtitles, that's a really easy one. Provide audio track adjustments for each audio track, so different considerations for like sound effects versus music versus people talking. So here's a great example from Diablo. You have both who the speaker is, what they're saying, there's also audio going through this, but then also a picture of the character that's talking to really help you if you're like, I haven't figured out who Leah is yet, but there's her face and okay, there she is in the game. StarCraft, a lot of our games have this, but this is just one example. So you can see in the volume, there's master volume, but then it breaks down into all these other things, and you can really customize that. I think this is becoming a lot more normal in games now, where you can kind of adjust different audio channels individually. If the player has a hard time hearing audio cues, so this is one where like those like kind of effects where you hear it before you see it kind of thing, but if you can't hear it, you're sort of screwed. Make sure that sound isn't the only way you convey information. And this is pretty like for anything. Just make sure you have multiple ways that people can notice things, whether it's a flash and a sound or a sound and some kind of UI change or whatever that might be. Just like pair notifications together essentially. Offer captions for background noises. So subtitles are sort of like the things that people say. Captions are any of the environmental effects or things that make sense of kind of beyond just what people are saying. So like if you're in a rainy environment, but it's not super clear that it's rainy, if there's a rain sound effect, you know, and then I know, okay, cool, that's this environment. So Fortnite has this where you have a survivor screaming for help, but there's also a UI call out that says, hey, there's a survivor nearby that needs your help. And you can actually see on the mini-map exactly where that person is. So if you don't hear that call out, you can see it and then kind of visualize where it is on your map. Same thing, Portal has the, like, you can see large wall panel movement. So that's like an environmental, like, if you can't hear that the panel is moving, there's a description for you to tell you kind of what's going on. Same thing with ping maps as well, right? So it's a sound and a visual. I put Heroes of the Storm on here because I work in Blizzard, but also because I think the way they do it is kind of cool where, you know, there's different symbols associated with each of the things as well as different colors. So you see it, color, icon, and audio cue. So 3 ways to kind of visualize that. If a player has difficulty progressing through the game because they forget what's going on or they can't remember what they were supposed to do, allow players to customize difficulty. This is probably a harder one for you guys to implement in student projects, but I'll show you a couple examples. Let people progress through content at their own pace. Offer some space for tracking any active tasks you have, so like quest logs or reminder text and stuff like that is a really good way to do this. Highlight any interactive elements so people can clearly identify what in the environment, like you guys have probably seen this a lot where like the one thing you can touch is a totally different like format than anything else in the room. And then highlight important text or like what people need to pay attention to. This is something like as a researcher, people don't read anything. So any tutorial I put in front of somebody, they get maybe like 10% of it. But if you have highlighted text, it kind of calls their attention to like what do you need to really be looking at here. So this is from Tomb Raider, and you can see here the difficulty customization is also granular. So you have the combat difficulty, exploration difficulty, and puzzle difficulty. And so let's say you're somebody who's like, I suck at fighting, but I love Tomb Raider games, and I want puzzles, and I want to be able to explore, but I really don't want to fight anything. You can customize that and have that experience. If you're somebody who's like, I want to beat everything up, but I don't want to solve any puzzles at all, you can do that experience as well. So I thought this was a really cool way to handle that. And this is an example, but it looks like, so this is for the puzzle difficulty, or no, this is exploration difficulty. So you can see on hard, like, there's no indication at all that this is a special object. Normally you get a little bit of like, maybe somebody has climbed up here. And then easy, it's like very clear, like, you can probably go up this. The quest log from World of Warcraft. So not only does it track what you're supposed to be doing, but it also gives you these highlighted areas of where you need to go to do that stuff. So if you're not totally sure where the Crenshaw it is or whatever, you can check your map and see highlighted areas where exactly you need to go. And then this is a good example of several things. So Ocarina of Time, you have progress at your own pace because the text won't advance until you press the A button. You have text for the character. You also have highlighted text for Saria's song is the important thing here. That's what we're learning. So several really great accessibility things in one screenshot. Speech stuff. Player cannot or does not want to speak in your game. Offer options if there's a multiplayer to play without voice. Having that as a setting can save people a lot of grief because some people will get in and either not have their mic plugged in or not want to talk or whatever it might be, and everyone starts blaming them. So now you're giving them an option. Let me find other people who are cool with not playing with voice chat on. Offer some visual means of communications, emotes, any of those like communication wheels, dances and games. Those are all great examples. So this is from, man, I don't have my notes on this, so I can't see it. I can't recall what game this is from, but they had like your site profile before you get into a match, and you kind of say like what your motivation is in playing and all this stuff. One of the things was I don't talk, basically, and so you can set that off, and then it'll try to match with other people who don't want to use the voice commands. Overwatch has a bunch of communication things, and you can actually keybind specific emotes and stuff like that to your whatever device you're using. The emotes in World of Warcraft is another great example. So you don't need to actually say anything. This list is like huge, but you can actually do it through emotes, and it'll write out a description of what your character is doing. And then some general best practices. So having accessibility details on your package or on your game website, on your itch page, whatever it might be, that stuff gets a ton of traction. So there was like, I can't remember what game it was, but somebody gave me this stat of like, they put like, hey, there's a colorblind mode as like one line on their thing, and they got a ton of articles that are like, this game has colorblind mode. It's got it. We're super excited about it. So like it can get a lot of traction in the community because oftentimes players with disabilities are having to do all these janky workarounds to get into your game. They want to play your game, but they're going to do weird crap to get into it so that they can actually play. So if you're like, hey, I designed this with you in mind, it's a lot more like, that's awesome kind of thing, you know? Have accessibility details in games. So Celeste did a really good job with this where they had an assist mode, and what they did was they call it out at the beginning and they're like, hey, this isn't the way that we the designers intended this game to be played, but we know some people will need this to actually play our game. So here's what the details are. We encourage you to try it without first, but you can basically make yourself invulnerable and have infinite resources and like do all this stuff, and it's here for you. Make sure that your settings are saved and remembered between sessions. If you're somebody who has to have a really customized setup, and each time you get into the game, you're going to have to re-customize that setup, it sucks. And it makes it so much harder to get into your game flow. So having saved settings is super important. Making accessibility options as soon as somebody boots up a game. Let's say you're somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing and needs subtitles, and the game opens with a cinematic before you turn the subtitle on. Sucks. So having that available up front, like even if it's just a title screen, you have options available right away. And as soon as they enter the game, they see that same cutscene. Great way to handle it. And then do testing with players with impairments. Probably the easiest one for you guys to find access to will be friends who are colorblind, or friends who wear glasses and can play a little bit without them on and tell you how like clear different elements on your screen are. But yeah, bring those people in, like ask them, how do you find this experience? What would make it better for you? What is difficult for you right now? So this is an example. EA has this really awesome site. It's like ea.com/able, and they have the accessibility features for all of their games there. It'll route you through what franchise you want, what game in that franchise you want, what platform you want to play it on, and then it says, hey, here's all the features. It's also got like walkthroughs for like, hey, you need to turn on this specific feature. Here's how you would do that. And it's got pictures of everything. It's super great. Really good way to like kind of document this stuff. Again, here's the Celeste mode, Celeste assist mode.
Last year, actually, this guy by the name of Josh Straub reached out to me, and he was asking if I was going to GDC, and if I was, if I can use him and talk to him about accessibility in games.
Growing up, my options for entertainment were limited. What developers need to realize is that video games do more than just entertain the disabled. First of all, they provide an escape from sort of the these doldrums of being disabled. And second of all, they provide a social space where instead of being judged by the physical appearance, we're purely judged by the actions that we do and the things that we produce in the game.
I went to Bruce and Neil, our game director and creative director, and I explained to them what Josh had explained to me, which was like he loved Uncharted, huge Uncharted fan, couldn't beat Uncharted 2 because there's a series of doors that the button mash through at the end.
I was faced with the reality that I had played this entire game, I had spent $60 on it, and I could not get any further without the help of an able-bodied person.
The truth is that in order to play our games, we really require a pretty high bar of proficiency for use of the dual stick analog controller.
One of the big things in terms of accessibility is let more people enjoy the experience that you are also experiencing.
I started talking to Alex. She was like, well, you know, during The Last of Us, we started, it was sort of an initiative for accessibility. Let's make this for a wider audience, but how much wider can we make it?
You don't need to make the game so that you can play it with a head split. You just need to make the game's controller flexible enough.
Coming onto Uncharted, we had a lot of a big push for including more accessibility features.
So we have an option now you can set so that you can hold down the button and get access if you're pressing the button continuously. And that works for things like when you're lifting a door up, or we've even incorporated into our melee, so if you hold down the punch button, then it'll continue to punch. The main thing that I was interested in was trying to make it so that you could play Uncharted 4 without using the right stick as much. Basically, you don't have to use one stick at a time. And we've had to implement a couple of specialized features that you haven't seen in other games. For instance, since we are a cover-based shooter, when you take cover, the camera has to pan around to be able to see the direction you're looking. That was one of the first things we noticed that you needed. Second thing is when you're in combat, you need the camera to also help point the enemies out. So there's a little bit of help towards, if you're running towards an enemy, the camera will push a little faster in order to get them into your sights. And then the second thing we implemented was a lock-on feature. As you pull your aim button, then it'll snap to a target and you can choose.
We pride ourselves on being an inclusive community for our gamers, so it's just a natural extension that accessibility would be a priority for us as a company and for Naughty Dog as a studio.
When I first came on to the multiplayer team, I realized that we had always had our team set up as red team and green team. And it was really hard for me to be able to play the game because I am colorblind and I couldn't tell the difference between red and green sometimes. So I asked them, can I just change it to red and blue? And I went ahead and changed it in code and nobody ever questioned it. Now we have red team and blue team.
I think video games for a lot of people are often about being able to do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do, experience great adventures. And so when you find that there are some people who can't enjoy those things, it's kind of crushing.
The goal of our accessibility initiative is really just to try to make our game as widely accessible as possible, so that really you can come to our game without having to worry about, am I going to have trouble interacting?
When I turn on a game, like Uncharted, I'm not, climbing a wheelchair. I'm a splash-buckling, narrative like, this is great. That brief period of escape, why accessibility is so crucial. Because the more games that offer that, the more people with disabilities will be able to escape and have better lives.
After hearing that, I was like, okay, like this is important, and I want to, make sure that everybody gets to experience this and have fun.
So that touches on several things that we've kind of been talking about throughout this. One is that accessibility gives more options. Gives more options. It's not changing the way the game is experienced for everybody. It's giving options to let people customize their experience and play it in a way that's comfortable for them. Accessibility is about giving access to people who wouldn't be able to play your game otherwise and let them enjoy the thing that you spent all this time making. These are the things that we want you to be thinking about when you think about well, why would I spend the extra time to put in a colorblind mode? How many more people are you going to be able to let play this game and let play the game effectively? So it's really about allowing your players to fine-tune their own gameplay experiences. And I want to show you one example of a game that came out pretty recently. It's called Way of the Passive Fist. And they went ham on accessibility stuff, which was awesome. So you have difficulty customization, but not just difficulty, it's enemy strength, it's the number of encounters, it's how your combos work, it's how your resource management works. There's video settings, so what's the brightness? Are there shaking effects? Screen shake can give people with vertigo and stuff a lot of problems, so turning off screen shake is a really big one. Is there information during combat to give you more context to what you should be doing? Are there flashing effects in the game? Control settings, so this is on the Switch, you can tell, but setting your key bindings and things like that, allowing you to customize that. And then audio settings, again, with those separate channels for how loud different elements of the game are. So this is like a really awesome way to just have like a ton of stuff in a game that, again, like, we were talking about Uncharted before, where it's like huge AAA, whatever. This is still from a bigger company, but like, it's obviously not as like graphically intense or whatever. Like I've seen you guys make games that are like similar style and things like that. So this is something that you can work into your projects. So some suggestions if you're like, where would I start with this? If I wanted to do this, what are some things that I would consider? Colorblind mode, and if you have the bandwidth for it, a filter strength setting. So letting people customize, because it's not like there's red, green, colorblind, and blue, yellow, colorblind. Like within that, there's variation. So letting people set the strength of the colorblind filter can really help. Keybind remapping. Even if you have only one device, I know for some of the capstone students, like you guys had keyboard or controller support. So I would challenge you also, like think about, are you allowing for control remapping in those cases? Subtitles. If you already have a script, it should be pretty easy to put subtitles into your game. And allowing for customization or how they're presented, size, anything like that is extra bonus. Allowing for resizable UI elements. This might be a little bit out of scope for some of your stuff, but it's one good way to kind of practice how would I handle this stuff. If somebody needed to blow my UI up 200%, what would that even look like on the screen? This one is definitely out of scope for you guys, but if this is one that's become really big because there's a new law that has come into effect that's affecting video games called the Communication and Video Accessibility Act. So games that are released after January 1st of 2019 need text-to-speech and speech-to-text included in them. And it's for accommodations for people with disabilities. So if you're somebody who can't use voice chat, can't hear voice chat, that is transcribed for you in a text format. So this is something like when Apex Legends came out, everyone was like, whoa, look at these features, and it's like, that's CBAA in action. So yeah, you'll start to see a lot more of this now. And then for sound toggling, if you have stereo or mono sound toggle, that's a really good way. Some people will need just the one earphone, other people will need the surround sound so that they get all the cues and kind of where they're coming from. So one thing that I think is really important, and like, you're always like, I have a time limit, I'm on 10 weeks for this project, like how much can I get done? It's not something that's extra or additional, it can't really be worked into your normal design process. It should be a default. There's design decisions that you can make that will make your product more accessible that don't involve including any additional features or any additional customization. There's just things that you can make standard. And by designing accessibly, you're creating a more inclusive product that will give more players access to the experiences that you're trying to create. So if you were disassociating for the last 45 minutes, most of your players are going to benefit from accessible design choices at some point in their lives. Leveling up your skills in accessibility now will make you that much more competitive when you get onto the job market and start looking for game design jobs. And there's a ton of existing resources that can help you think about accessible game design and help you start putting those kind of things into practice and stuff that you're making right now. So that is everything, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah?
How did you start getting into UX research? I'm interested in pursuing a career in the future. I was like, when did you, at what point did you start getting into like research?
Yeah, so the question is, when did I start getting into research? I did my bachelor's degree in psychology, like I mentioned, and actually experienced a lot of pushback from my professors. I'd be like, I'm interested in psychology and video games, and they'd be like, and violence. And I was like, no. And they were like, and addiction. And I was like, no. So it was sort of hard for me to visualize what research in gaming looked like. What actually kind of showed me, like the first time I ever saw somebody who did what I did was when I was 21 years old. So I went through like most of my life being like, this isn't even a job that I can do. And there was 2 researchers at Xerox Park where I interned for a little bit who had like the biggest data set of World of Warcraft characters ever, and it was all stuff on like what people were doing in game, and they had like some government grant to study it, and I was like, what? And that was sort of really where, like, I knew I liked research because I had been doing it for my classes and stuff already, but it was always sort of like disconnected from gaming. And that was really the moment where I was like, I can actually do this for video games. There's real human beings doing this for video games. The Games User Research SIG was another really key one because I was in a room with a couple hundred people that all did what I did or wanted to do what I wanted to do. And hearing people from like Microsoft and Bungie and Riot all talk about doing game research, I was just like amped. Like I left that, every year I leave that summit being like, I'm so glad I do what I do, this is the best thing. So that was sort of my, like how I opened my eyes into game research and stuff.
Summit? Where and when is this?
Come hit me up after this, and I'll give you some more info. Yeah. Yes?
What makes you want to pursue accessibility in user research?
Yeah, so the question is, why did I want to get into accessibility in addition to the UX stuff? So alongside this Games Research Summit that happens every year, there was another event for games accessibility specifically. And it was something like my best friend that I game with, he's colorblind, and so it comes up every once in a while when we're playing something and he's like, what am I looking at? And I have to kind of walk him through whatever it is because he can't tell the difference. And so it was something that had always kind of been like, oh yeah, this is a thing, but I'd never thought about it in any actionable way. And I was like, hey, I'm gonna be up here for this game research thing anyway, why don't I attend the Game Accessibility Summit the day before? And it was this crazy, emotional, eye-opening experience for me where it was people in the industry who were actively, their full-time job is working on accessibility, and hearing them talk about it. Players with disabilities who came and talked about how important games are for them and the things that they deal with when they're playing games and what they look for in good games. And I was just like, this needs to, like, everybody needs to know about this. So it's normal practice on my team where if you go to some kind of conference or something, you write up a little like, hey, here's what was there and here's some cool things I learned. And mine was basically like, we all need to work on this now. Like, and everyone was like, this is super cool. We should work on this, Nikki. You should definitely do something. So I was like, okay, cool. So I just sort of took it on as a side project. And a lot of the ways, like people will talk about industry sometimes where it's like 80-20, so like 80% of my time is like fully focused on all of my general UX research stuff, and then that extra 20% I will like spend on accessibility and like writing new decks or learning new stuff. Like this stuff, it wasn't anything that I'd interacted with really when I was in school still. I had to learn all this. I was like reading WCAG documentation and everything like over the last year, like while I was working at Blizzard. So. You can learn new things when you're old, is a good takeaway here. But yeah, if it's something that you're interested in, I really encourage you to look into this stuff because there's a lot of people who are incredibly passionate about this and have made resources readily available for people so that they can make this stuff better. One cool thing that I learned about at the Games Accessibility Conference is that there's now 7 people in the games industry who are dedicated to accessibility full time. So the one that I know the most is a friend of mine, David Tisserand, who works for Ubisoft, also started as a games researcher, started working on accessibility, and now does accessibility work for Ubisoft and their studios full time, and making sure that they have accessible products, that they're soliciting feedback from people about accessibility, all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty sick. It's getting a lot of traction, which makes me really happy. Yeah?
So I've been playing Nier Automata, and that game has a surprising amount of accessibility features. And I just want to say that I super appreciate toggles. That game's sprint and lock-on are both on toggles, and I have like tendinitis in both my arms. So it makes playing action games, which are my favorite genre, incredibly difficult, and having like even small things like that is like super nice.
Yeah.
I just wanted to shout out my appreciation for that.
And there's like, yeah, there's a lot of things, like to that point, like how many of you watch Netflix with subtitles on, just out of curiosity? Yeah. Oh my God, it's like almost everybody in the room. And so it's a thing where like that is an accessibility feature, but you almost wouldn't think about it that way because it's so ubiquitous now, or it's so default that games do this. I think one really good way to think about this, like just from a web perspective, is like maybe like 10 or so years ago, if you were like, hey, are we gonna make our website mobile responsive? People would be like, we got time for it. And now like if you don't have a mobile responsive website, it just like doesn't ship, like that doesn't go out. And I hope that accessibility gets to that kind of a point where it's like, if we don't have kind of like what has been decided as like a really good suite of accessibility features, this just isn't going out. We need to get that stuff in. That's my personal hope.
good design in general. To
Yes.
have readable text. Who would have thought?
Yeah.
I'm just, really struck by that.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, if you guys go through this, like any of the documents that I've given you, like either the games accessibility guidelines or the web content accessibility guidelines, there's like so much, again, that it's like, if you just think about this from the time you're creating the concept for your game, a lot of this stuff can be solved immediately. I think one thing that's also really important and good to keep in mind is like, retrofitting something to be accessible is like 800 times harder and more expensive than just doing it right in the first place. And so I think that's something that we should also shoot for, because like a lot of places will like add, later they'll add, I do think it's really cool because Apex Legends keeps updating their stuff with better features because of feedback from the community, which is great because taking feedback and actioning on it is really good. But like if you can get ahead of some of that stuff and like just up front be like, cool, we're gonna design our control scheme to work like this so you can only, you do it with one hand. Oh, I guess that was actually another accessibility thing. When I was in undergrad, there was like a joint class project thing that was like psychology students and computer science students, which I felt was actually somebody's weird psych experiment in itself, but that's like a whole other story. But my team actually we did like it wasn't really an RTS game, but it was like an RTS control scheme, and we designed it to be totally usable with only one hand, because a lot of touchpad games there was really complex controls, so we were like, you should be able to do all of your normal tasks with just with 3 fingers, basically. And that was like a weird baby project foreshadowing into my life. Yeah?
How has, this is kind of a weird question, but how has the accessibility community reacted to things like the Xbox accessibility controller?
Hugely positive. That's one thing is like, if you design your game with that community in mind, they're extremely loyal. And it's great for them because it's like, this is something that was especially designed for me. I know we talk about like representation a lot in a lot of the classes that you have here and a lot of the ways we talk about games in general. I think this is definitely like in that same vein, right? So the Microsoft Adaptive Controller has been super huge, especially because that device in particular interfaces with a bunch of other assistive technology. So let's say like Ken uses the Joust will plug into the Microsoft Adaptive Controller. So he can use, like, if there was keys that he wanted to use on that too, he can also use it and then have the Joust plugged in as well. So it's like a really great thing for customizing. Like I've seen images of like a bunch of different setups with that where it's like, okay, this person has like a button they press with their knee, and then they use one button on the Microsoft Adaptive Controller, and then they also have a foot pedal that they hit with their other leg. And it's like, that's one way. And then there's the next person has a completely different setup. So the fact that it's so robust is awesome because it accommodates a ton of different people. But yeah, good, short answer. Yeah.
What kind of accessibility options would you recommend for smaller games projects like the ones we do in VGDC?
I think colorblind mode is a really good one, and then contrast is like, so more of the designerly side of things I think is where you guys can really make a big impact. So like, I remember I mentored for Capstone this year, and I walked in the first day, we heard all the pitches, and one of the groups wanted to do like a color puzzle game. And my question was like, they let the mentors ask questions, and I was like, hey, have you guys thought about how a colorblind person would play your game? And everybody in the group was like, no. And I was like, okay, that's fine. And they were like, oh. But I mean, like, and they treated it like it was, oh my God, we shouldn't do this. It's gonna be way too hard and crazy. But it wasn't. Like, I went over, I didn't end up mentoring them, but I was like, here's all you need to do. Slap symbols on your things. Boom, like, you're done. So I think, yeah, color, contrast, sizing, I think those are some good ones to start with. You guys would know better because like I'm not as proficient on like the coding side of things, so I couldn't tell you like this is easy, just slap it into your game. But if you look through any of those guidelines, there might be things that stand out to you or things that you're like, this is an interesting design challenge and I want to tackle this. That you would know better based on your skill set of like, this seems doable to me in 10 weeks, or like, maybe I should save this for like a side project that I can tinker with for a lot longer. Yeah.
So, you talked about optional accessibility, but I've also noticed that more and more games are starting to become accessible by default, and I end up turning a lot of those features off. And because they end up feeling like way too hand-holding, this kind of thing. How do you balance between the people like me and the people that need those features in the defaults?
Can you give me an example of one? I'm just kind of curious, like what's something that you've experienced recently? No pressure.
Like, now that you're talking about it, I can't.
That's okay. So I think deciding what's going to be your default is like a really tough question, right? Because default won't accommodate everybody. There's like always going to be some degree of customization that people want to put into their experience. If there's things that you're turning off, I guess like another one of my questions would be like, how much time is it taking away from your gameplay to go change your settings once and then get into the game?
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, I think having the options available, because like for you, let's say the default setting you hated, but there was no way to adjust it. That's sort of the flip basically for anybody who lives with disabilities. So yeah, I don't know that I would say that there's like a best way to decide like what's the best setting for default, but just that offering customization means that people will be helped way more than if you're just like, this is default and also that's it. So, yeah.
So I play a lot of fighting games, and fighting games are slowly becoming not only like more accessible for like all these different types of players who want to play them, but they're becoming like accessible in a way that is like easier. So like for Dragon Ball, for instance, you play like Dragon Ball Fighters, you play keyboard, mouse, gamepad, and then fight sticks, which is what most like the tournament players will play on. And so you can customize like your inputs the way you want them. In my opinion, I think that it is like they have like a lot of good visual settings, a lot of good audio settings. And then on the side of like barrier of entry, they will have like auto combos. They have reduced the amount of inputs, so you don't have to do Dragon Punch inputs. You only do quarter circles, which are very easy for most players. And you only have like four buttons. But like because it's like a fighting game, people will still get turned off by like the skill level that is required. So I wanted to know if you had like, and I don't know if this is entirely like UX related, but I wanted to know like what goes on when you're trying to balance like the barrier of entry as far as skills concerned versus the barrier of entry as far as just like getting to touch the game.
Yeah. So some of that might come down to like how like, and this is just my speculation, right? How the game is advertised, right? If they're putting in all these cool things to like make it easier for more people to play the game, like how are they getting that across to the community? How are they tapping into other communities who like, where are the people who are like, I might enjoy a fighting game, but I've never played one before and I'm terrified that I'm gonna get shit on. Like, how do you get to those people and let them know like, we're welcoming you, we're trying to make this a good space for you. I think the fighting game community is actually a really good example though, because sometimes people will bring up things about like, well, games are hard and they should be hard, and like you just have to get good at it, like especially with competitive games and things like that. But like the fighting game community thrives on competition and is still adding in features that help more people get into that scene. And there's ways, you know, again, because it's always an option that you turn on, you can set a competition that says, okay, we're not going to do auto combos, we're not going to do, you know, these other things. And do that. You can also set up a contest where it's like, it's only auto combos, it's only, what is it called, like the flourish style or whatever, like where you just button mash and they do cool stuff or whatever. Yeah, there's also, I do want to like give a plug to Sightless Combat. So he's a professional Killer Instincts player who's totally blind. And the Killer Instincts devs know that he's a huge hardcore player and so continue to put things in, like all of the menu options have a sound cue associated with them. And it's always set up in the same way. So he knows like, I gotta bump down this to the sound, I turn the background music to 0, I turn all the like grunts and audio cues up to max. And then every ability has a different sound cue tied to it. So there's like videos of him fighting like the final most difficult boss or whatever, it's like Shadow Jago or whatever. And I'm like, this dude can't see anything, I'm dead. Like I'm already dead just watching this. But yeah, he kills it, and like especially with fighting games where it's like frame perfect, you have to get that grapple within like a fraction of a frame, and dude crushes it because he has the audio cues.
Sorry to interrupt. It's 7 o'clock.
Okay.
We have time for like 1 or 2 like final questions, and then it's pizza time.
Does anybody who, like, I don't want to cut people off, but does anybody who hasn't asked a question yet have a question? Hi.
Hey, oh sorry. So just arrived here. What's like a 30-second summary of what?
I'm going to skip that and go to a question from somebody who's actually seen the talk. Yeah.
So with like a game company like From Software, where they're kind of notorious for being so difficult, there was that whole controversy with the Sekiro game that came out with how a lot of players were finding the game to be too difficult, and the developers have decided to take the Celeste style approach where you can modify your experience. So, in your opinion, what would be the best way to kind of fix kind of what happened?
So I don't know that I have a solution for like the best thing. I do think it's really important that the community is talking about it. I don't know that the discussion is always the most productive around that topic, but I do think it's important because the only way you would get change in a situation like that is to start having a discussion. What are the pros and cons of this? Who are we excluding if we don't do this? Who are we potentially upsetting if we do include this? Is that, is upsetting somebody going to be the end of the world if now a bunch more people have access to the game? So there's like a ton of questions, and like it really comes down to like the dev's decision, right? Like not every game is going to be the most accessible thing on the planet, but can we work towards stuff? I think one thing that's really cool is Sekiro has a lot of accessibility features. They have subtitles, there's control remapping, like they have that stuff built into it. So there is some stuff there already. Is customizable difficulty thing the next, like Tomb Raider had? Is that the next step? I don't know. I'm not on that dev team, but like I think it's good that people are talking about it and like what the pros and cons are basically. That was kind of a weird answer to it. Cool. Thanks everybody.